Go ahead.
There you go.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. It's early for me and it's early for you. And I hope that the prayer that Oscar prayed will be abundantly answered in this little session that we have. I wonder if you would be willing to communicate with me because I'm kind of curating, I'm using material from other workshops and books that I've done for this series. But what I would like to know from you is, can you give me feedback that'll help me know if I'm on the right track? Because I can't minister to you if I don't know you, or I can, but it won't be as precise. And so I would like to speak to what your struggles really are. So I figured since it was a group of single people, I think you're single, if I'm not mistaken, most of you anyway, that could talk about forming romantic relationships, that should be a section here. And for that, I'm going to be drawing from some work that I've been doing for a series that I'm working on with David Ashrick called Try This at Home. We have been running a marriage workshop for the last few years, and we're moving now into a dating workshop that we're going to start to work on. And each one of these workshops is producing a book. The marriage book just now is being released and is in print. So we're really excited about that. And we're also going to be doing a dating book next. We're eventually going to do a parenting workshop and book. We hope to do a whole book on sexuality. So we've got big plans and I'm excited about that. But I'm going to be drawing in my presentation today from the unit on dating. And I hope that's meaningful to you. But would you do me a favor and tell me what has been meaningful to you so far in the things that I've presented? It's very challenging to do Zoom presentations. Typically, in a public speaking context, you can kind of read the faces and the body language of the people you're talking to, and that's much more difficult on Zoom. So you kind of feel like you're talking into nowhere. It's a little challenging in that regard. And also, it's difficult to have back and forth dialogue in a Zoom meeting. So there's some challenges with a Zoom that we don't have with live meetings. And could you help me overcome those challenges by just putting in the chat what has been meaningful and helpful to you so far and help me understand if I'm on the right track or if there's something in particular you would like me to address? I would be willing to consider that. I have things framed out, but there's some flexibility in what I'm going to be presenting. So if you don't mind giving me some feedback so that I can get that, that would be helpful. All right, I'm going to jump in and share my presentation for this morning. Again, this is our series to love and be loved, keys to healthy communication, connection, and conflict management. Oh, and I forgot my transitions. Oh, well, we'll just be popping from one slide to another. So, my talk today is I kissed dating hello. And those of you who know a little bit about mostly Christian history, which I'm going to be going into in a moment here, you know that there was a very famous book that was released in the 1990s called I Kissed Dating Goodbye. And I'm going to be going into the history of all this and why these things are so. But what some of us learned is that kissing dating goodbye was not a great idea, that people actually need that experience, but it needs to be done in the right way. So I want to start out by saying that the dating is an effort to form, in a Christian context, it's an effort to form a partnership, i.e., a marriage. This is God's institution. It was one of the first institutions that he laid down there in the Garden of Eden. And marriage is a very beautiful and wonderful thing, as we will be learning in this session, and that I'm sure you've learned in many other forums. It's a good thing because everything God creates is good. Dating is merely our present day effort to form such a partnership, and whether it's done well or not, it's still typically with that in mind, especially in a Christian context. Prior previous cultures, such as the ancient Near East, from which we derive our biblical stories, were definitely not accustomed to dating. It was not part of their custom or culture to date in the way that we do today. Some of these things are transcendent. They don't really matter. You can do things different ways and achieve the same results. The way that they did partnering back then was very different than the way we do it here. But I think we can even draw from some of the biblical stories about partnership forming lessons that are relevant to today. And I think that's true of the story of Isaac and Rebekah. I have a painting up here from the story of Isaac and Rebekah. Many of these biblical stories have inspired beautiful classical paintings, and I like to use those. So this is a picture of a painting of Rebekah at the well. If you remember this story, Abraham sent his trusted servant to find a wife for his son Isaac. He sent him back to Canaan, where his relatives were, to find that woman who was from a godly family line. And the servant got to the well of the town that the family lived in. He knelt down and prayed, and he asked God to lead because he needed a miracle. And when he literally opened his eyes, there was a beautiful woman standing there, and she turned out to be Isaac's wife. So that's what this painting is depicting. But it's a beautiful story of how God led in a partnership. And in my view, it's mostly about the man and the man's family, you could say, implementing the process of partnership. Of course, the woman played in very heavily too, as Rebecca responded to the invitation. But it's pretty much a man initiating. And then if we look at the story of Ruth, we see a woman being more the initiator in the process. It's interesting. So it's almost like God gave two really great biblical stories about a divinely orchestrated partnership. One of them is found in Genesis 24, and it's mostly about the man implementing this process. And one of them is found in the book of Ruth, and it's kind of more about the woman initiating the process, although there was interplay between both sides in both stories. So I want to assign these stories to you as a great way of arriving at timeless biblical principles of forming a partnership. As you remember in the story of Ruth, she literally dressed up and lay down at his feet while he slept after working on the threshing floor all day long during the harvest or during the barley harvest. That's a pretty wild thing to do. Like if she did that today, obviously the cultural context is different. If she did that today, it would be like, she did what? It'd be crazy. But it was apparently appropriate in that time. My point is just this, that she was assertive and she took the initiative. Now, realize that he was an older man, and so it probably in that cultural context would have been inappropriate for him to be the initiator in the relationship. She had to show him that she was willing to be approached by an older man and that she was okay with that before he would make a move, so to speak. So there was a lot of dynamics at play, but it's a beautiful story of how God led in a partnering process. And we're going to develop these principles and we're going to develop these ideas about forming a life partnership in our dating book. And I really encourage you to follow me on social media and David on social media so that you can be apprised of when we start to make those presentations, because there's going to be a lot of really good information for those of you that are interested in in getting married. Now, I want to say this, that some of you may not be interested in getting married. One of the things that the Bible does is it holds the tension between the beauty of the marriage institution and the beauty of not being married. God says marriage is good, but he doesn't say in his word or indicate in his word that everybody has to get married to be blessed. And so we can see in First Corinthians chapter 7, this is the main biblical passage that is used to describe the gift of celibacy, is what we call it, that it's okay never to be married, and that's a blessing from God. And I'm going to be talking today about marriage and how, or dating and marriage as part of the larger system of relational education that God gives us in that life timeline I showed you earlier. And it is true that marriage teaches us things about love. It is a powerful teacher. You can learn all the same lessons as a person who never gets married. I don't want you to think that because God uses marriage so often in so many people's lives and so mightily in their lives to teach them about Himself and teach them how to love, that there are wonderful and precious lessons to be found in marriage, that you're somehow missing out on those lessons and on those valuable blessings if you're not married. I don't want you to think that because being unmarried, God can still lead you and teach you how to love and be loved. By the way, we're going to be getting more into that this is my third session, the last two sessions, we'll get into some of that. But Paul says, I wish that all men were even as I myself, but each one has his own gift of God, one in this manner and another in that. He's saying, I wish that everybody was single like me. Apparently, Paul was single, although there's some debate about that. But he acknowledges that this is a matter of God's gifting. And then he says, but I say to the unmarried and to the widows, it is good for them if they remain even as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, let them marry. For it is better to marry than to burn with passion. So that's the biblical teaching on this, that it's fine to be alone. It's even recommended to be alone. It does simplify your life not to get married, but it's a matter of what you can manage and what you can bear as a person. He's saying it's okay to be married. That does provide a context for sexual release, and the only biblical context for sexual release that is really condoned and blessed by God. But he said, go ahead and follow in the footsteps of Jesus, first and foremost, but in his footsteps as well, and stay single if that's what God is leading you to. Again, this is the life timeline. We have relational experiences at each stage. And notice, as I pointed out yesterday, that friendship precedes the spousal stage, the marriage stage of the life timeline. So, one of the best things you can do if you are a person who wants to get married is really refine your skills of friendship. All right, I want to get into dating as kind of a practice and look at how partnership was done over the course of recent history. This is fairly recent history, and it's Western history because I don't have time to take on history from the beginning of time. But I want to just give us a little context here. In the 1800s, courtship happened in the woman's home. There was a lot of protection in that. The couple would come and typically sit in the parlor, and the family members would be kind of in the house, a lot of times snooping. If you've ever watched any of Jane Austen's movies, that's kind of how it was, although those typically took place in Europe, England, to be specific. But even in the United States, that courtship practice was very similar. And in some of those movies, you'd see the family members, looking through the door and spying on the couple as they associated with each other. It's kind of a tongue-in-cheek thing and kind of a joke, but it was a blessing that the couple got to carry on their relationship initially in the context of the family's home, especially the home of the woman, because women are at a certain amount of risk in a male-female relationship, particularly if they don't know that man very well. And so there were some good things about that. But in the early 1900s, courtship then transferred into dating. And this was especially true once the automobile was, invented and then became commonplace, because you could take that relationship outside the home and engage in extra home, you could say, dating and spending time together. And so that's how dating began. Well, initially dating was for the purpose of finding a life partner. That was the whole point of dating, is to be with that person for a period of time, date them repeatedly. If you fell in love, you decided you would get married, you would get engaged, and if it went according to the typical protocol and even the protocol that to some degree the society supported, but definitely the church supported, you didn't have sex before you got married. You just spent time together and then you became engaged and then you got married. And then sexual contact, sexual experiences came in that context. Well, that kind of changed during the sexual revolution. The sexual revolution started in the 60s. In fact, it started when I was on the cusp of being a teenager. I remember the sexual revolution as a firsthand experience. And I experienced to some degree the horror of the sexual revolution. I was a young person. I was not a Christian at the time. My family attended church, but not in a real meaningful way. I wasn't a Seventh-day Adventist. I am a Seventh-day Adventist now. I'm very serious about church, attend church weekly, try to follow God and His Word. That was not my experience as a young person on the cusp of puberty and the teen years when the sexual revolution hit, because those two things overlapped. And I can tell you that it was a scary time because people were having sex with everything that moved all of a sudden. It's pretty wild. And I'm going to show you some statistics on that in a moment here. But the church's response to that in the late 1900s was purity culture, purity culture. And I'm going to be unpacking that a little bit in a moment here. But let me show you a study first that sort of illustrates what the sexual revolution looked like in numbers. Some researchers did a study where they just asked a simple question: did you have sex in high school? The class of 1950, 24% said yes. The class of 1975, 65% said yes. And the class of 2000, 69% said yes. Where do you see the gap? You see the big gap, not between 1975 and 2000, even though that was the same amount of time, 25 years. You see the big gap between 1950 and 1975. That right there was the sexual revolution. It led to just a proliferation of sexual experiences outside of marriage. Well, how did the church respond to this? What happened ultimately after the sexual revolution began was AIDS. And AIDS, many believe, was a consequence of licentiousness in the society, because as people, it was primarily impacted the homosexual population, but then drug users, IV drug users, and so forth. It was a plague. It was an epidemic. It went from just a few obscure cases to, I believe at the height of it, it was 24 million cases, but I may have that number wrong. At any rate, back to the question of how did the church respond? All of a sudden, all the best efforts of the government were failing to contain this problem, and people were dying. So the church stepped up and said, we can do lecturing and promotion of a method of preventing all infection. We can do it in our public schools, we can do it in our public institutions, and we will do it for you. And the government said yes. And that bulletproof way of preventing all infection, all sexual transmitted disease infection, was faith-based education. They taught people abstinence. They taught them, don't have sex and you won't get this disease. And so there was this coalescence between the government and the church that was really kind of unprecedented. If you think about it, whenever the government becomes afraid of the safety of the population, they're more willing to take on, to basically compromise the separation of church and state and some of our other liberties. There's always this tension between safety and freedom, and typically when safety is threatened, governments become more willing to compromise freedom. So that was a little bit of a compromise of separation of church and state going on there. least potentially, but that's what happened. As part of the larger movement that grew out of faith-based abstinence education, and the larger movement was ultimately called purity culture. And kind of the beginning of that part of the movement came when a book was published. The book was published. The book was called I Kissed Dating Goodbye. And it was written by like a 24-year-old kid. I mean, he was barely out of his teens. His name was Joshua Harris. And that began the sort of resurrection of the practice of courtship as practiced some degree by ancient Near Eastern cultures, but then also it was kind of mingled with the practices from the early 1800s. And this model of life partnering emerged from that movement that we call courtship. And there were some issues with it, some good things about it, but some issues with it as well. So, what I want to do is I want to check out the models. What I mean by that is, as I see it, there are three different models with which we can approach the partnering process in a church context. Now, there's other models out there. There's one called hookup culture. Most Christians aren't into hooking up. And so I'm not even going to go into that, but I'm going to look at the models that are kind of known in church circles today and look at them for their value and how effective they are. I would say that there are three models. One of them was modern dating. This preceded, even in church circles, the modern courtship model. But modern dating, according to the world, and to some degree this happened in the church, is for the purpose of forming a relationship, but not necessarily a marriage. And once a person forms a relationship, then at least in today's version of modern dating, sex is part of that. It's just a given. In fact, dating and sex have become synonymous. Oh, I'm dating this person. That means you're having sex with the person in the secular realm. And to some degree, that has impacted people in Christian circles, Christians, because when they're serious about a relationship, they figure, well, I'm going to be with this person. We have a relationship. I can't imagine us not making it to the altar, so it's okay for us to have sex. That's kind of how the reasoning goes. And so modern dating, even in a church context, can be rather reckless. It can lead to broken hearts and unnecessary damage. Let me say this, that it is impossible in the pursuit of a life partnership. You know, love is a dangerous game, and it's impossible to avoid all hurt. It's impossible, but I think we can minimize it. And I think the modern dating model does not minimize, but rather maximizes it. So that's a flawed model. Then the courtship model came along. And I would say that one of the core characteristics of the courtship model was it was correcting for recklessness. So it became very cautious and in some respects became overly cautious and downright fearful. And a lot of damage came out of that. What we're doing is we're developing a third model we're calling covenant seeking, and we're trying to be gospel centered in our approach to it so that we're not unwarrantedly reckless, but we're also not fearful because perfect love casts out fear. A really great book that I stumbled on, and I've read many books on dating and many books on courtship in the process of writing the book that I've written. And one of the best books that I came on was Courtship in Crisis by Thomas Umstattd. He wrote a blog, this is 15 years ago or so, in the sort of the height of the courtship movement. And his blog questioned courtship. Now, he had started out a riotous supporter of courtship and had written on it, but he had a conversation with his grandmother one day. And his grandmother asked him about the courtship model. She said, so how does this work? And he explained it to her that the young person doesn't spend time alone with another young person that they may be interested in because there's too many dangers in doing that. So they wait until the parents agree that it's an okay relationship to start, and then they start courting. And the grandmother said, that doesn't make sense. you have to learn, what's out there before you can decide if you're going to court that person. And then he went on to explain that the courtship was really effectively an engagement almost, and was a very serious relationship. So you would go from like no relationship at all to an extremely serious, almost committed relationship. And she said that doesn't make sense. Young people need to play the field, so to speak. But she said they need to do it the right way. And in her generation, which was called the Great Generation, what they did was even high schoolers were allowed to date, but they did it generally in public places. So there were other people around because there are some dangers involved and some protections that need to be in place. And they also did not date more than once. They would date that person once, but if they dated them more than once, they were going steady, is the terminology they used. And so, like high schoolers were too young to go steady in some parents' minds. And so they didn't let them date more than once, but they dated. And Thomas Umstattd listened to his grandmother and realized that he had the model wrong. And he decided that dating did need to happen, but it needed to happen the right way. So let's look at
Mm.
these in some detail. These are the different models that I mentioned. Modern dating, again, begins typically the way it's done is it begins restrained. People don't just jump into bed because you're dating someone, but it's focused on that deeper relationship. Once that deeper relationship is formed and you're now dating that person, they typically have sexual contact. But half to 85% of those deeper relationships fail. So there's a lot of broken hearts as the result. 30 to 40% in modern dating have sex within the first month. And we do know, for example, and this is among other facts about multiple sexual partners, that the more premarital partners, it tends to predict divorce. Although I'll say this, and I don't want to discourage people that have already been sexually active, that you're going to necessarily be divorced. It's the more recent premarital partners that tend to have a higher predictive effect on divorce. So, in other words, if you have recently had multiple partners, you're going to be more likely, if you do get married, to have divorce. But it tends to correct itself if there's been a large time gap. And typically the person has matured and learned more self control and so forth. So that's modern dating. What about modern courtship? Our reaction in the Christian realm to the dangers of modern dating was to try to button things up and tighten things up. So there was, again, little to no interaction between opposite sex people. The girl was typically sought out through the parents. That was deriving that from the biblical model, which is typically how it was done in Old Testament and New Testament times. They went from no contact to a committed relationship. And I can say this is true, maybe not in all courtships, but in the courtship that I had that came out of purity culture, that's what it was. There was very little contact, maybe a conversation here or there, but a conversation with a lot of control and restraint. And then suddenly you found yourself in a committed relationship. There was no or low physical affection in that relationship, which I see as basically a good thing. It's one of the better aspects of modern courtship. But the entire purpose of it was marriage and engagement and then marriage. So some of the principles of courtship included that virginity is purity. Now, that's not really true biblically. It's great to be a virgin when you're married, but people achieve purity through the blood of the Lamb. Their robes were made white through the blood of the Lamb, not through virginity. Virginity, in and of itself, does not indicate purity. It can be a fruit of purity of heart that we want to protect our virginity and wait until marriage. But to, equate it with purity is a mistake, and it ends up really discouraging people who have been sexually active and perhaps repented, or people who were sexually abused. They felt that they were defiled. This is typically women, that they were abused by a relative or someone. It was totally not their fault, and then they felt defiled. One of the other principles of the purity culture was a strong emphasis on modesty. modesty was so important to an extreme degree, though, and typically it was put on the women and not so much on the men. And it was also very much limited to physical modesty of covering the body versus other aspects of modesty. It was kind of a reductionist definition of modesty. And it, again, unfairly pressured women to live up to a standard and not so much the males. There was also a principle of headship with almost as ownership. In the Old Testament, we see this, that women were basically owned by their fathers until they were married, and then they were basically owned by their husbands in some cases. And that was a kind of broadly the case with ancient Near Eastern culture. And obviously that walks over a line. There's a place for a protective head in a family, and I think a father should protect his daughter, but not in such a way that he's protecting his property as if he owns his daughter. That crosses a line. And so that headship as ownership thing was very subtle, but it did come out in some cases in purity culture. And of course, there was no dating allowed. Another one of the principles was wait and it will be great. Sex will be great if you wait for it. And some young couples did that and found out that you still had to struggle to figure out how to make love to each other effectively, but they wouldn't talk to others about it because they felt that they would be besmirching the image, the public image of the movement of which they were a part. So it is not true that if you wait, sex is going to be easier necessarily. There is a learning process depending on the couple and the situation. All right, so let's just talk a little bit about a couple of things, little anecdotes from purity culture. This is one of them, the chewed gum analogy. The pastor or spiritual leader in promoting purity would put a piece of gum in his mouth, chew it, and then offer it to someone else. And of course, the person would respond with revulsion. It was disgusting. The point was that if you have sex before you're married, you're like a chewed piece of gum. This ended up being kind of degrading and hurtful to people, some of whom were already struggling with feelings of being damaged goods. Umstad brings out the fact that modern dating leads people into a premature physical commitment. They're having sex with each other like a married couple, and their bodies are basically saying we're married. And then if they break up, there's all kinds of biochemical and emotional problems, nervous system problems that arise out of that. But he brings out that modern courtship basically led young people into a premature public commitment. So both modern dating and modern courtship really kind of jumped the gun, you could say, and led young people into commitments they were not necessarily ready for. Well, as is the case with pretty much all movements that have anything wrong with them, there's going to be a deconstruction process. And as we know, there's a massive deconstruction of conservative Christianity going on in our church today, in our culture today. I'm not super fond of the deconstruction movement. I find that it's unmoored and that people have overcorrected and basically let go of the foundations, most of them. But there are some people that are deconstructing and trying to create something constructive from those broken pieces. I have a friend, Sarah Casper. I don't know if you guys know Dee and Sarah Casper. She has a ministry called, what's it called? Hey, You're Brave. She went through some damage from purity culture and so forth, but she says what she and what Dee says they have done is disentangled themselves from the things that were wrong with purity culture without disentangling themselves from the things that were right. Because look at the True Love Waits pledge. This was very prevalent in the 90s. I don't think this is terrible. I'm making a commitment to myself, my family, and my creator that I will abstain from sexual activity of any kind before marriage. I will keep my body and my thoughts pure as I trust in God's perfect plan for my life. That's not really a bad thing. So, what we need is not to just trash everything about purity culture, but we need something better. Something better is the watchword of education, the law of all true living. So, what we are working on, David Asherick and myself, is this covenant seeking model. And in my view, covenant seeking has three phases. Now, let me just say this up front that no model is perfect and no model should be dogmatized. These are suggestions of how to do things, but not so that you can check little boxes and think you're doing everything right and that you're going to get some kind of magical result as a result of that. So it's a model, meaning apply it with wisdom and care. So this covenant seeking model begins with what I call friendship dating, where you're dating a wide variety of people, typically in a public place. And the reason for that is, say you meet someone online and you set up a date with that person. You don't know that person. You don't know their background. Very often, you don't know their social network. It's risky to spend time alone with that person. So do it in a public place until you can get to know them. And let me add this as well, that there is some research to the effect that you're more likely to have a successful courtship and engagement and marriage if you choose that person from your social network, because there's a certain amount of screening in knowing people that know that person. There's a screening effect. You're going to find out if the person is in the habit of narcissistic abuse of people that they date or whatever. And so it's kind of risky. Like, we're doing a lot of online dating these days, and it's kind of inevitable, but it's kind of risky at the same time if you don't know that person's background. So we need to create forums where people can meet people within their broad social network, and we're going to work on that as well. So that's friendship dating, where you spend time with people, you get to know a wide variety of people. And then if you meet someone who looks like they have potential, then go ahead and do committed dating or courting, you could call that. And then ultimately that can lead to engagement. Again, friendship is the best preparation for your ultimate romantic relationship. Notice that in the Song of Solomon, she says, "This is my beloved and this is my friend." Person you ultimately marry, if you do marry, will be a very close friend, among other things, but they will be a very close friend. I want to tell you a quick story here. This is a friend of ours, David and mine, Nathan Renner. He's a pastor in Tennessee. He met Becky, his beautiful wife, early in their young adult life. She was obviously very pretty, and a lot of guys wanted to date her, and he was one of them. So he went to her and said, "Hey, are you interested in, courting," or whatever they called it? And she said no. So he said, "Okay, well, can we just be friends?" And she said, "Okay." And they started to spend a little bit of time together as friends, appropriate time. Effectively, they were doing friendship dating. And she ended up getting interested in him. So I don't believe this thing like being friend zoned is the end necessarily. I think you can transition from friendship into a romantic relationship. We know there are many modern movies to that effect. So the point is, friendship dating, meet a wide variety of people, date one person at a time, realize that once you start to date repeatedly, you're kind of getting into the commitment realm, and you need to be honest about that. Be in public where possible. Limit your physical expressions to friendship expressions would be my advice. A quick hug, that type of thing is fine, but I would not physically do any kind of romantic gestures with a person that you're not necessarily committed to. And be ready to have the state of the relationship conversation. You have to be frank with one another and mature enough to say, where are we in this relationship, and discuss it together. Okay. One of the two most important questions you ask when you are entering into a committed dating relationship is, are we ready and are we compatible? I'm not going to read this because we're limited for time, but I really encourage you to go to Galatians 15, verses 16 to 24, and study the sins of the flesh in contrast to the fruit of the Spirit. I'm sorry, that's Galatians 5. I don't think it's 15. That's typo. Um, yeah, the sins of the flesh contrasted with the fruits of the spirit. Basically, to answer the question, are we ready for a serious relationship? You need to not have the sins of the flesh in your life. You need to be out of pornography addiction, for example. You need to be out of any kind of infidelity going on, any kind of strip clubs or any of these types of things. You need to have repented and left those things behind. Don't bring those things into your marriage. You also need to be healed from previous sexual relationships, and those relationships need to have ended. If you still have drama with an ex, yeah, that's not a good thing to bring into your present relationship. Spiritualism is another sin category of sins of the flesh. I would just say this about spiritualism: beware of modern movements. Modern movements often have spiritualistic roots. I won't get too detailed about that because I don't want to get into those conversations, but just be aware of that, that pop culture is saturated with spiritualism and we need to be guarded against it. The third category, and this is the largest category, is the sins of strife. If the person you are thinking of getting into a relationship with, or if you have a lot of conflict in your life and you tend to have strife and you tend to not be able to get along with people, that needs to be repented of and left behind. There's such a thing as a high conflict personality, and that needs to change because I'm telling you, once you're married, you need to be really good at managing conflict and getting along with people because you share everything in marriage. And then finally, substances, any kind of drunkenness or drug abuse or anything like that needs to be left behind. And the fruit of the Spirit needs to be in your life and the person you're considering's life in abundance. And we can continue to grow in these things throughout our lives. But that's the best template I know of preparing for a marriage, a relationship as challenging and as intimate as marriage. Now, there needs to be some consideration for compatibility. Apparently, the research seems to indicate that you don't need to be like that person in personality. There can be quite a contrast in terms of your personality differences, and you can still have a healthy marriage, but you need to have similar faith, values, habits, and mission in life. So look at those things. What are the principles that guide your life? What are your standards that you live by? Those are the things that need to line up, because if you have large disparities in those things, it's going to lead to conflict. So let me just end with a couple factoids here. What about who asks to date? This is very interesting, but in one study, 93% of women preferred to be asked out and 6% preferred to do the asking. This is post-feminism. 83% of men preferred to do the asking and 16% preferred to be asked. So the vast majority of men and women want the old model of the men asking. I did a little poll on Facebook and I found out the same thing, that all the women responded. This is a small pool, it's not a large sample, you might say, but all the women responded wanted to be asked out, and 83% of the male responders wanted to do the asking. So that is the exact same, almost the exact same number as was on this formal research. Isn't that interesting? So we still want generally to men want to do the asking, but I will say this, that women have their part to play. I mean, Ruth oiled her hair and put on her makeup, what was makeup in those days, and went down to the threshing floor and slept at his feet. She did something to show her availability, and so women need to find ways to do that as well. Dive into the dating pool. That is the next step once you have all those things in place. Obviously, this was a sweeping overview of a lot of information. We could go deep on a number of the points that I made, and we will go deep in our upcoming book, but I wanted to give you that summary and get your feedback. Any questions or comments?
Thank you for your
Okay.
time and the presentation. I thought it was awesome and I love the points. And I always try to have keywords so that I can remember. And I do want to add,
What's your name? Is your name iPhone?
my name is Brenda.
Okay.
Brenda. So I am 29 and dating in this time and world and at this age is so difficult. Um, it's a weird place to be. But
Yeah.
I do want to add too, though, like it's to put yourself out there, you also have to be somewhat I don't want to say healed, but
Yeah.
you have to be aware of, if you're dating, so is the other person, right? And you have to have that communication and that conversation of if it's open, like I'm seeing other people, like if it,
Mhm,
I guess before it gets serious,
mhm,
because I know for some of us, and I think me when I was younger, I was a bit jealous, of course. And even though I was not 100% committed to a person, or I knew that they weren't for me, I would still get jealous. I would still get
mm,
upset if they were talking with other people because I wanted to be the only one. And even though I knew that we weren't compatible. And I think that's kind of important to recognize too
mm,
is if you're dating, so is the other person.
mhm.
And I just
Well,
kind of
that's
wanted
what
to add
I
that.
yeah, that's good. That's what I meant by have the state of the relationship conversation. Like
Mm,
establish whatever you're doing. If you think like the problem arises when you think it's a committed relationship and they're dating around or the other way around. So make sure that you're clear with each other about what each other thinks the relationship is. And that's hard. It takes a lot of maturity. And you're
hmm
right, Brenda. I know that it's a dangerous game today. David and I really want to help on multiple levels to move the culture in a healthier direction and keep us in your prayers. Okay. So a few comment, Marco.
Good morning, Dr. Jen. How are you today?
Yeah,
Yes, ma'am. No,
good. Sorry.
it's
Good.
that's okay. I might have been delayed there, but no, and it's interesting. And you made a lot of excellent points, and I really appreciate your insight on this topic. And it's like Brenda mentions. Sister Brenda said, you know, dating today's different, and of course, Brenda's 29 and I'm 54, so there is a big difference in what I used to consider dating. When she was 14, dating was different when I was 14, of course. Especially with technology and things like that. I was old school, go to the front door, knock on the front door. Father, mother would come to the door, and then I'd take the girl to the car, open the car door, get her in, and we'd
Yeah.
go to town.
I
Um,
wish
you
that was
know,
still that way
well, I'll tell you a funny
sometimes.
story, short and sweet. I had a young man come pick up my daughter one time there at the house. I'd just gotten home from work. It was a Friday, and I guess it was about almost 7:30, 7 o'clock. And the young man pulls up, and I'm sitting in the living room. I had a picture window facing out to more towards my driveway, and the young
Yeah.
man pulls up and honks. He
Hmm.
honks the horn, and I kind
Oh,
of, my daughter coming out of her bedroom. She's like, "They're here for me." I was like, "Okay, well, have a seat." She's like, "What do you mean?" I said, "Have a seat." Well, he's here. I go, "I know he's here. Sit down." So she sat on the couch and she's like, "Well, let me text him." I go, "No, ma'am. You put your phone in your pocket, and I'm going to wait for that young man to come to the door." And he's honking and honking and honking, and I'm just waiting. Finally, I see the young man get out of the truck, and I walk to the door. I wait for him to knock on the door, and I opened it, and I said, "Young man, is there something wrong with your horn?" He's like, "Excuse me?" I said, "Is there something wrong with your horn?" I said, "I kept hearing your horn honking out there." He's like, "Oh no, sir." I said, "Well, what was the idea of the horn?" "Well, I was just letting your daughter know that I was here." I was like, "Well, she knows you're here." I said, "But customarily, I appreciate a young man to come knock on the door and talk to me about where he's going to take my daughter." I said, "So if you want to continue seeing my daughter, I hope you get into that habit, because if not, my daughter's not going to go anywhere with you." "Yes, sir. I apologize." Blah blah blah. And the young man knew who I was. He knew me. Um, And then after that, and of course that was a failed relationship. I had already warned my daughter about the young man, but sometimes these kids have to
Yeah, they
experience
have
it
to
for
face.
themselves. Yes, ma'am. But I'm old school. I'm flowers. I'm pull out your chair. I'm open the door. That's just kind of me, and it's kind of funny. And even I say yes, ma'am, a lot to women that I talk
Yeah.
to, and I get women that tell me, "Please don't call me ma'am. That makes me feel old." And I'm like, well, the way I was reared, I still tell my father yes, sir, and he's 80. My mom passed away 8 years ago. I told my mother yes, ma'am, until she passed away. I mean, that's just the way it was. That's the way we were reared. Um, and it, the women of today, and I'm not bashing women. Trust me, that's not my intent here. But they're more independent. They're strong women. They're independent women. They don't need a man. I had one woman tell me one time, "I don't need a man. I want a man." I said, "I understand that." And I'm the type of guy that is like a cheerleader for a woman. I'm there to help them. I offer, "Hey, what do you need help with? Can I fold those towels for you? Can I mow your yard? What can I do for you?" And a lot of the women kind of push away from that. They're like, "No, I don't need your help." They always want to do it themselves. And I frown upon that because, once you get in a relationship, they might not relinquish that power that they have of wanting to be helped. And I think that can be detrimental. And I think another thing that's very important for us to understand is children. I've been in relationships and I've told women, children are part of the equation. If your child doesn't like me, we're not going to go very far. And I respect the children. I've always treated them with respect. And then, of course, I expect them to treat my children with respect. My children are older now. I'm an empty nester. But I think that's a big factor is the children in relationships. As you get my age, you date a lot of empty nesters, but then occasionally I've dated younger where, they might have a fifth grader, a seventh grader, an eighth grader in the home. And that becomes a part of a factor in your relationship. So, but it's a two-way street. It's a two-way street. And I put jokingly in the chat that I have a bachelor's, a master's, and a doctorate in singleness. Yes, ma'am. But we're trying. And I guess it's just a matter of just being patient. I put it in God's hands. I had asked a woman to marry me about 7 years ago. And I hate to say this, but I have yet to meet a person that meets up to what all the boxes that she checked off for me. And I guess I'm just very critical about that, but I'm not comparing them. I'm just saying the woman that I asked to marry me, she checked off a lot of boxes. We were very compatible. It didn't work out after a while, but I'm still looking for the woman that can check off all those boxes for me, and allow me to help her, be my best friend. That's what I've always thought is, if I can find somebody that can be my best friend and we can do things together, eventually that relationship will grow. So I know I've talked too much, but thank you for allowing me
No, that was
to
great.
give my input.
I loved your story. And I want to say this, that I wish that some of those chivalrous, those symbols of chivalry would be brought back into our culture. I think they're beautiful. For example, opening the door for a woman. It is not because the woman can't open the door. That's ridiculous. That's not the message that's being communicated. If a man isn't there, she's gonna have to open the door. It started with castle doors that were too heavy for women to open, and so men would open them, but it became a symbol of chivalry. And that's what it is today in our society. And essentially, that is the strong protecting the weak. And women are physically weaker than men. So you really can't deny that. And it's a beautiful thing and a gospel thing. So when a man opens the door for me, I'm like, thank you. That's a beautiful symbol of the strong caring for the weak. Okay, we got to kind of rush here, but our Daly and then Michelle.
Yes, good morning, everyone. Hi, Jennifer. Thank you for the presentation. You did mention earlier that you wanted honest feedback, right?
Yeah.
Okay, well, here we go. I think that the information is good, but for me, it feels a little bit outdated. Like the issues that are being brought up. Unfortunately, I'm in my 40s now, divorced, and the issues that I see now with dating are way more advanced than like, oh, just like sex before marriage and all that. Some of the things that are challenging now is, for example, you're dating in the church and you're divorced, and the stigma that goes along with that for other SDAs. Then there's also different movements in like cultural movements that are saying that, okay, well, men are toxic just because they are men. And so when you try to date somebody, those are some things that you run into, because the expectations are going to be a lot different. Then there's also, say you're more established, that you've in your career and you have assets and things like that. Deciding to date somebody, it's a huge risk that that person could just wake up one day and just be like, you know what, I don't want to be married anymore, and I'm taking half your stuff. So these are like and I wish it was just like something you see happening in the world, but it's almost the exact same thing happening in the church. So there are a lot of like cultural things going on, and it's going, and the same thing is being reflected in the church.
So you're saying the effects of what might be called toxic feminism that leads to the denigration of men generally has really impacted you. And as you've encountered it in the broader culture, that has seeped to some degree into the church. And then also the complications of marrying when there's divorce and children involved. And that's just presents a whole, this would be what I presented here. And I don't know all of your age and where you're all at in the life process, but this would be, it's the only work I've done, but it probably would be the thing to show high school and college kids. And you're right, there's a set of problems that arise as a result of, being married before and having children and all that makes it more difficult. And I take to heart your statement about, toxic feminism. You didn't use that term, but I take to heart that is an issue. And I see it impacting young men in particular and discouraging them. So thank you. I appreciate the input. If you don't mind, put a summary of it in the chat. Michelle.
Good morning, Jennifer, Dr.
Good morning.
Jennifer. I have been loving your presentations. I just have a question. I've lately been into I guess you call it a model, and I'm not sure if it's that or not, but it's the idea of the masculine versus the feminine. So I don't know if you will be touching on that, or if that's something that, because I find myself, I'm single, I'm 51, divorced, and not necessarily, I have been interested in dating, but I've been so busy. My kids, I'm just a recent empty nester. So, however, I am interested in finding my life partner. But I am so involved in this masculine versus feminine that most men that I've encountered are so much in their feminine that it's difficult for me to be able
who are
to.
some of the thought leaders that you're reading, and what material are you consuming on that issue?
Honestly, to be completely honest, I haven't read any books. I haven't.
Okay.
No, this is mostly like social media.
What social media accounts are you following?
I'm following several of them, but I don't have their names, and I'm sorry for that. I'm just.
Is it like the trad wife movement, or?
I'm not sure.
Because I follow a guy on Twitter that's really into that, and I think there's something to it. I think there has been an emasculation of men, and they're, like you said, so much in their feminine. Yeah.
And what
I just don't want to overcorrect, because I think that's what
right.
humans do, is they overcorrect everything. But anyway, go ahead.
Well, I mean, the idea that really that I really I guess like about it is the fact that the masculine, they provide, protect, you know, they're the providers, they're the protectors, they're the ones.
Yeah.
So they're the planners. They plan because if they really want the woman, you know, they plan. She is. And it's not just about her taking and just being the queen or the princess. It's not about that. It's because once she is in her feminine, then she gives back. She multiplies what he has. And so she becomes a huge blessing to him
Yeah.
in return. So that's the idea. So when
Mhm.
a guy wants you to be the person to initiate, when the guy wants you to be, he is in his feminine at that point. And so,
Well, I mean,
I don't
look at
know.
that research that I shared. Still, even after even post-feminism, most people want the guy to ask, and almost all women want the guy to ask, and
Yes.
most men want to do the asking. So that's like kind of indicative that this is not expungible. It's in
Right.
human nature for men to take the initiative and lead in the relationship. It's there, you know?
Right. Right. Yeah. I just wondered what
Yeah.
your opinion was of that.
I
So,
would just say I'm aware of that movement, and I would just say it's probably overcorrecting in some ways
mhm.
from feminism, because feminism was pretty ferocious and it came in and did a lot of good things, but it did some damage as well. So, and I don't like it. There's toxic feminism that just drives me crazy. And yeah, so I'm not totally unsupportive of that sort of vein, but I would just say beware that human beings tend to overcorrect.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. And share with me if you think I'm very easy to find. Just, find me online and send me any links or anything you want to share with me that you think would be helpful.
I
All right,
will.
well, we're probably way over time here. Oscar, take control. Speaking of men taking control.
Hmm. Thank you, Dr. Jen. I was going to ask one question, but maybe you can address it tomorrow.
Oh, you can go. I
There's
mean, it's fine with me. I don't mind.
oh, there's one of the things you're talking about, the sins of the flesh, not to bring into
Yeah,
the
yeah.
relationship, sexual sin. Um, what would be the advice for for single people who are divorced? And I'm not divorced, but I'm still married. But I'm just asking for
Yeah.
friends. How I've seen that there's a tendency when they start dating, uh, that purity concept. Since they've already been intimate, since they were already
Yeah.
married, it's like
Yeah.
harder for them to set that boundary. What would you advise, uh, to help them have that boundary and for them not to think it's okay to do that?
I know it probably feels a little like you're infantilizing adults, but I think it is important to have appropriate safeguards in place, even when you're dating as an older person, because becoming sexually intimate with a person creates a whole biochemical response that effectively, emotionally, and to some degree, spiritually and physically marries two people. And if you don't end up married, then you are going to go through a breakup, and it's going to be painful and have psychological and even physical repercussions. So the same laws apply regardless of whether you've been intimate before, been married before, or what. But I can see where it would be easier to think, oh, well, you know, I've already been to this rodeo, and to let down your guard. But I think the same principles apply. And I would say make sure that when you're together, you're in public places as much as possible, and that you're accountable. I would have accountability in your friendship circle as to how you're conducting your life morally with people of the opposite sex. And there, to have like a small group type thing where you're putting before people your struggle and your needs, and having people pray over you is a really important, because secrecy just, when there's secrecy, it's gonna it's like a culture for sin. It's like put it in a petri dish and let it grow if there's secrecy. So being open with others, confess your sins one to another and pray for one another that you may be healed. I would have that piece in place. That's off the top of my head.
Mm.
Yeah.
I guess what you're saying, just educate them as to the repercussions of being intimate
Yeah.
with someone and not.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's still there. Like the God wasn't just setting rules for people to throw his weight around. There's actual damage that occurs from casual sexual contact or being sexually connected to someone and then breaking up that causes damage. And there's just so much I could say about that, but we lack the time right now. But those are just the laws of life. They don't care how old you are.
Hmm. Yeah, thank you for sharing, because I've seen,
Yeah,
sadly, even in the church,
I
you know,
know.
you shared First Corinthians chapter 7, verse 7 through 9, and said it's the only context for sexual release is
Yeah.
marriage. And a lot of people today kind of just don't even in the church, don't.
I was gonna do a session tomorrow on sexuality. So is that something you guys would like? How many of you think that would be helpful? And I would be talking about, the biblical teaching on sexuality, various aspects of it. And I won't get into too much detail, but I think it would, it just follows from this session. So anyway, we
Yeah,
should
that'd be great.
probably wind up here, but feel free to reach out to me and give me your input on whatever you want to give me your input on. I'll put my email address in the chat.
Awesome. Thank you very much. God bless you.
Yeah, God bless you too. It's been a really good conversation.
Yeah, an hour is not long enough for these
No,
topics. But thank you very much.
you're welcome.
And God willing, we'll see you tomorrow.
Sounds good.
We're going to go into prayer and praise reports right now. So I'm going to stop the recording.